So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Punishment and Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment and Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Danielle Roods, who is a professor of criminal justice and criminology at Sam Houston State University and deputy director of the Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence, or ACE. She will be discussing surviving solitary, researching residents and staff in restricted housing units. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A, and you can put your question or name in the chat anytime to get a queue going, or at the end, you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A. As a reminder, we are recording this session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat, and then I can read it during the Q&A session. Additionally, we have another DSS series talk coming up in about a month with Rob Worth, and emails will go out today or tomorrow with the details of that talk. So with that, I turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here. And I will also put a plug in for Rob Worth. He and I were grad school colleagues together at Irvine. He's fantastic. So if you're available for his talk, definitely come back. I'm going to talk today about surviving solitary, researching with residents and staff in restricted housing units. Today's talk is going to be a little bit different, I think, than other talks that I give. Instead of giving you a lot of the findings from the research in the book, I'm going to give you more methods. I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit on the craziness that is doing research in prisons, and even worse, what does the research look like when you do it in restricted housing units? So it'll be a good talk, I think, and it's the part of the conversation that I think scholars often don't have about the secret nitty-gritty backstage, behind the scenes details that happen when you're trying to put together a research project in a carceral space or in any space, really. So with that, I'm just going to get started. If I can get my slides to go, hold on. They just don't want to move. Okay. So in terms of sort of navigation of what the talk's going to be like today, I thought I would talk about sort of my framing of research. I'm a qualitative researcher by training. I was trained by someone who was trained by anthropologists, so I have a very deep underpinning anthropological ethnography sort of root. And then I'm also an organizational sociologist. So my work tends to look at organizations, and I prefer to look at correctional organizations. And in the last almost decade now, it's been institutional corrections for me. So both in prison, sometimes in jail, not as often. And then most recently for the past, well, not COVID years, pre-COVID years, 3.5 years inside restricted housing units. The way that I think about the research is that I'm telling stories of and for the people. And I don't always just mean for the people who I'm interviewing or observing. I also mean for all people, right? So that we can understand the human condition, so that we understand what people are going through in their spaces. I think back about old books like Studs Terkel's Working, right? When he was talking to people all around the country about what their jobs were. I think that's the kind of person I want to be. I want to not expose what's out there. I'm not an expose kind of girl, but I really want to understand how people are living, how people are working in spaces. And for me, the custodial space has always been really fascinating, and I'll go into that a bit in a minute. I think about researchers as being curators or presenters of, I almost had narratives here, and this morning I added the word interpreted narratives, because I really think that the interpretation of those narratives is what you get when you read ethnographic work or any kind of qualitative work. I also have begun to think even more deeply than I did, a decade or two ago, about my own positionality and the positionality of my research team, and how that interferes with or helps, sometimes messes with, our retellings or our ability to craft a narrative based on the information that we gather in the field. I think you know this already. I'm not going to tell you something new here, but I think personal and professional identities matter greatly, not only for the folks I'm talking to in terms of my research, but also for the people who I have talking to them. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about the methodological decision points that we have to endure as researchers in this field doing research, particularly in carceral spaces, but you can use this anywhere. And it gets really tricky, I think. At least it feels tricky to me. I don't know if you'll think so. So my backstory, if you've ever heard to talk by me before, you've heard this before. So I'm going to try to give you the quick version so that you don't have to bear through my story again, but it's really important to who I am as a scholar and why I do the research I do. And the reason I'm telling it to you is because I think your backstory is also very important, right? The sort of humble beginnings, or maybe not so humble for some of you, they're humble for me, beginnings of our lives and where we came from lead us down certain pathways, and they lead us to ask questions in a certain way, or to present our bodies or ourselves in a certain way. And I think that matters a lot for the kind of work that I do and the way that I do the work that I do. So the story is quick one. As a little girl, I was brought up in Norman Rockwell land, right? Everything around me was literally idyllic and perfect. My grandparents owned a 200-acre farm. I was outside with the cane pole. I was skinning my knees and climbing trees and making mud pies and doing all kind of crazy stuff as a little girl. That's just my experience, right? It was all country, all outside, all nature, very loving and supportive family. My father died when I was 4, but other than that, there was not a single hardship in my life until my late high school years. Everything was idyllic. And we would have to drive a very long way to get to a grocery store. I lived out in the country. And my mother would put me in the car and drive me to the grocery store. And I think around the age of 3 or 4 years old, standing up in the back seat of a car prior to car seats, I began asking questions about a really ugly building in the town where we went and bought groceries that had bars on the windows. And I wanted to know what that building was. And I don't remember these conversations, but I'm sure that my mother's response was something like, it's a place where bad people go, right? And so over many years, you can picture me as a 4-year-old, and then maybe a 6-year-old, and then maybe an 8-year-old. Now I'm like, older. Every year I would, ask questions like, what did they do to get in there, right? When I was bad, I got sent to my room. I didn't go to the house with bars on it, right? I didn't go there. What does that mean? And then I began crafting all kinds of crazy plans of how I was going to try to make their lives better, right? If they're locked in there and they can't get back out, what can I do? And so I'd pack my little backpack full of my little girl books, and I'd want her to take me there so that I could read them stories. She was like, basically, hell no, you're not going to read that one. No, we're not going there, right? You're 5. And there was just all these like, well, can we go visit them? Can we call them? When do they get to come out? Could we help them? And she was always just like, what? No, stop it. We're not going there. It just didn't look like the other buildings in my town, and I couldn't figure it out. And those are the beginnings of my interest in prisons. And it was a jail, but in my interest in carceral life. And then growing up in upstate New York, the city filled up filled up its prisons and began to overflow, and they didn't have enough space for people. Highlight of the Rockefeller drug laws and other really tough on crime sentencing laws in all of New York State, all around the country, actually. And so New York started buying up farmland in upstate New York where I lived. So as a little girl, there was one prison within a 50-mile radius of my house. By the time I was in high school, there were 6 within a 50-mile radius of my house, all medium and maximum security facilities, all on former farmland. Every one of my high school friends, and now their children, all became correctional officers. With the exception of one. Actually, there's one that doesn't. But the rest of them, their wives, everybody works in the prisons. That's what you do in those small prison towns. And I imagine most of you on this call already know that. So it has become sort of this all-encompassing story of my backstory, right? From starting these questions early about what are they doing in there, what's happening to them, why did they get in there, what bad thing did they do, all the way up to can I help them, and now to holy cow, my friends are working in there and they don't act the same and they don't talk the same and they seem different, right? So those questions follow me throughout my life. I worked in the Mission District in San Francisco for Goodwill Industries, working with people who were formerly incarcerated, people who were in drug and alcohol recovery, and some people who were caught up in TANF reform. I went to graduate school and began formally studying something that had been of interest to me for a very long time. In that story, though, I don't point out to you, but I want you to look at me so you know that my race and ethnicity, my gender, my sexual identity, all of the roles, my age, my abilities, my experiences, all of that is caught up in that story, right? And they change. Some of them are dynamic. Some of them, my race, I can't change, but many of those things change over time. My feelings about particular sentencing or my feelings about particular people will change over time. And that matters to me because the questions I asked as a 4-year-old are the similar questions to the questions I asked today, but they're different. They're laden with new expertise and new maturity, right? I'm an old woman now, those sort of things, right? I think it's important that you tell yourself those stories. You allow yourself to think back through those stories to be able to understand why you ask the questions in the way that you do. and how you position yourself when you go in to ask other people questions. So there's also some tensions that I wrestle with in that story, right? The idyllic Norman Rockwell upbringing that I was talking about is not the same as many of the residents in the prisons and jails that I study. Many of their experiences don't look some do, but many of them do not look anything like mine. I've also never been incarcerated, and I've never worked in a prison or jail as in a carceral way, or in a custodial way, or in any way, right? I've done work with people returning from custody. I still do as a volunteer, but I don't have that experience of being in there or working in there on a day-to-day basis. And so I need to be able to jump in and try to understand that experience, even though that experience for me will always be other, right? It's a separate experience that other people have. It is not one that I have been able to have or have had. I also think that the language and identities and understandings that I have are my own. And I try really hard, and this is impossible. I'm just going to say it. It's impossible for you to hold those at bay when you're doing research. But I do try really hard to allow myself, I want to say blank slate, but you know that's utterly ridiculous. I'm going to try really hard to be as cleanish of a slate as possible when I enter those spaces, so that I can allow whatever happens in those spaces to be whatever it is, and to not add my own perspectives and narratives to somebody else's experience, but to allow their experiences to have full voice, so that I take that into my field notes in a way that really honors it, so that it doesn't become mine, it stays theirs. Okay, so the nitty-gritty of the talk is really this disgusting mess of thinking about field work, beginning to craft field work, and then doing field work. And I'm not going to give you a qualitative methods seminar. I imagine that many of you have already been trained in qualitative methods. But what I want to do today is talk about prison work in a way that lots of people don't. I don't know. I don't know why they don't talk about it like this, but it's a disaster of a process. And I'm just going to sort of walk you through some of the pitfalls and give you some of the ideas of things that might help. So I think that a project begins sort of at the idea that you want to do it, right? I think it's the time when you begin thinking like, hey, I think I'm interested in X, right? That's when the project begins for me, but that isn't the project. It's just the beginning of what will become the project. I don't come up with a question or research questions and then find some place to let me do it. I don't have a bunch of research questions. I certainly don't have any hypotheses. I don't look for data. I don't run around looking for a data set that will help me answer questions or test a theory. Instead, I just am like, you know what interests me? X. That's when a project begins for me, right? When I have an interest in something. The massive undertaking, though, that becomes a project entails an enormous amount of organizing, planning, and meeting. And I cannot express to you how long that takes. When I put together the prison project, which was our first project in the DOC where we do most of our work, it was a better part of a year. I think it was a little over 13 months before we ever set foot in a prison. It was just nonstop meeting with people. We had to meet with all 5 unions in the state to be able to get clearance to go in. We had to go to the district headquarters and provide them with information. It took me forever to get IRB accommodations set up. Like, it's just a mess. I don't want to explain the sort of flexibility and the adaptability, I think, and it's just my personal opinion here today, that I think is required to be able to do this kind of work. It's never been, Danielle has an idea and she runs with her project. My project never looks anything like what I envisioned it would look like at the end. It always looks like something else. I just have to be okay with it. I'm not willing to sell my soul to the devil here, right? I'm not going to be like, sure, I'll do whatever project you want. I don't do that, but I also am willing to sort of bend every direction to make sure that I can meet the needs of a custodial facility, the IRB, and myself and my research team, right? And be true to what I think is right for the project and the people that I'm studying. I needed to find insider assistance in order to be able to do this. I think it's crucial. I also think it's ethical, and it's a responsible decision. I'm going to explain to you what that means in just a second, in order to choose a subsample or sample that is providing data to us in a voluntary way, but they need to feel welcome. They need to feel allowed to be able to do that. And then I have to negotiate with the IRB. So this pre-field work period is me literally freaking out, I think, trying to figure out how to get this together. So when the prison project began, it was a postdoc. I was working with a postdoc. She was quantitative. She wanted to do a study in the former prison system where she worked, in the prison system where she formerly worked, sorry. And she asked me to come in and do the qual side. We were going to do a mixed method study. She was studying legitimacy and procedural justice. Would I be willing to do some interviews with staff and residents that she was choosing at random from a list of everyone in these custody facilities? And my very first question was, which facilities, right? Like, how did you pick the facilities? Well, I haven't picked them yet. So we made a few phone calls, and it turned out that the prison system wouldn't let us pick our facilities. That's an ethical problem, right? That's a methodological challenge right from the very first phone call. And so we thought about it, we argued about it, we sort of navigated it together, and then we were like, okay, fine. What prisons do they want, right? So what do they want? And then let's figure out if that sample looks anything like what we would have chosen if it were us. So we asked them to pick, we were studying culture and legitimacy, so we asked them to pick 2 prisons that they thought had a rough culture, 2 prisons that they thought had a whatever culture, and 2 prisons that they thought had a pretty good culture. And then we asked them not to tell us which ones were which, right? Just pick 6 random prisons and give them to us. We needed to go to 2 female facilities and 4 male facilities. We didn't know which was which. We also wanted some variation in maximum, medium, and minimum so that we had representation of all 3. And we wanted them around the state. Those were our guidelines, right? So they picked them. We mapped them first. Yep, they were pretty diverse statewide. We looked at them in terms of gender. We did get 4 and 2. We also looked at their security level. We got some maximums, some medium, and some minimums. In fact, we had 2, 2, and 2. They perfectly addressed our concerns. I'm not sure that was the sample I would have chosen if I had been given the full range of the number of prisons in that state, but it wasn't bad. And then we wrote about it in the limitations and talked about what it meant, and it was reasonable, right? That's a flexible approach. That wasn't Danielle, the sort of ever like demanding researcher saying, damn it, I need prison number 5, right? It was me being like, okay, well, that was less than ideal, but we're going to make this work. And it turned out to be okay. That was just the first level sample, right? There's layers and layers of sampling that come after that. So then we designed an IRB. We went through that process. We went in, we did our research. Things worked out relatively okay on that project. I'm going to leave that one at bay just for a second. The second project was the restricted housing project, actually projects 2 and 3. So at the end of the prison project, the state invited us up to do a talk, present our work. We did. After the talk, they invited us out for lunch. We went out to lunch. We're sitting at lunch and the research director says something like, hey, now that you're done, what are you thinking you want to do next? I don't know if he meant in his prison system. He may have been like, now that you're leaving us, like goodbye. But I just got really gutsy, which is not my norm, right? I'm usually pretty shy. And I decided to just ask him if I could have what I wanted. And so during the prison project, we had done a random sample of residents. We call them residents instead of inmates to use a more humane language for them. We had taken a random sample for the surveys, and then we had taken a proportion of the sample on a volunteer convenience sample basis for the interviews. So if a prison had a housing unit, let's say J, and it had 100 residents in it, and we'd taken, let's say 10% random sample from there, that meant we had 10. We took then 10, I can't remember the numbers, but let's say 10%, so 1 per, or let's say 20%, so we have a better number. 2 people from that we would interview. And as soon as they were done with their surveys, we would ask for interview volunteers, and we'd take the first 2 people who volunteered, right? And that's how we got the interview sample. Turned out that we blew it, because when we went through the years worth of pre-data collection fieldwork ideas, we forgot to ask how we would interview people in the RHU. We had a random sample of residents that were being pulled for us and sent down to do surveys. We had private interview spaces so that we could then pull them aside and do interviews with them. We were watched, but not audio recorded or audio heard. So we had protected confidentiality. We had enough spaces for an entire team of 6 or 7 researchers to be able to do both surveys and interviews on site. We had lunches, we had motels, we had gas, we had cars, we had everything we needed. But we had completely forgot that some of our sample would be in the RHU when we showed up, because we randomly sampled them from all units. So when we went into the RHU, we got surveys without staples. We handed them out. We were so proud of ourselves. They completed them. We got volunteers. I went to the sergeant and said, hey, I want to interview, this guy in cell number 3. And they were like, what? And I'm like, no, I need to interview him. He's part of it. And they were like, absolutely not. You are not pulling dude out of that cell. He's in there 23 hours a day. He comes out to shower. You're not interviewing him then. He comes out for yard. You're not allowed out there. And so after I sort of held back my tears, right, I was like, okay, big girl, get it together, right? And so we didn't interview anyone in the RHU. So fast forward to the end of the project, we're sitting at lunch. How would the project go? Great, everything was great. We loved it. Thank you for your time. What would you like to do next, Danielle? My answer, we weren't drinking. I feel like maybe I should have had a margarita before I said this at the Mexican restaurant we were at, but I just said, I want to do ethnographic work and interviews in your RHUs. And he looked at me with a weird look on his face. He put his elbows on the table and said, great, let's get started. And so from there, the restricted housing unit study started. And that is a miraculous example of good luck, right? That isn't anything else. That's just me having good luck. We did a good job with the first study. I can't believe he said yes to the second study, but that is the access that I needed to be able to begin the hell that is what comes next, right? Once you get access, it's only just begun. So let me go to the next one so I can give you preparing for field work. Preparing for field work means that you have to now get ready to go in, right? And if you know anything about prisons, you know that that's not easy. You have to get someone to not only let you in and then, sort of wave you through. You have to be able to go through the security procedures. You have to be able to get through the gate. You have to have your name on the gate check. You have to go in. You have to go through the metal detector. You have to they count the number of pens that we take in and the number of pens that we take out sometimes. What we're wearing has to be accounted for. My team has to be trained. All of that has to happen, right? But we also have to think about our sample. What are we going to do here? Because if you know anything about prison cultures, Mondays don't look like Thursdays. And the 6 to 2 shift does not look anything like the 2 to 10 shift. And housing unit J doesn't operate, even though they all operate under the same policies and the same rules. Housing unit J doesn't look anything like housing unit D, right? Even if they're all the same style of housing, they don't look the same. They don't feel the same. They don't act the same on any given day, because what's happening in them is human. The people living in there are human, and the people confining those living in there are human. And so you have all kinds of humanness happening in those spaces. And so there isn't one prison culture or even 20. There's hundreds of them on any given shift, on any given day, with any given particular officer and set of residents. So we had to, as a team, think about what month were we going to go in, talking to the prisons about what goes on various months of the year. When do they have another audit? When are they getting a PREA investigation? Did they have a recent suicide? Is there anything happening in that institution that would potentially close them down or make things different enough that they wouldn't look like normal day-to-day activity? We don't want to go in right before Christmas. It's a very hard time for the residents and a very hard time for the staff. We want to make sure that we don't go in when they're doing any kind of auditing, or when they have any kind of maintenance and people have been moved around, or they're, instead of being double bunked, they're now triple bunked. That data would be really useful for the renovation, but not so useful for day-to-day operations. We also have to then take our data sample down another layer. Which prisons are we going to go to? And I kind of went over that in the last study. But then which units in which prisons? It is unlikely that they're going to let us into every unit in a prison. It is also unlikely that we're going to get to them all. Like, how much time do we have here? We don't have an endless amount of time to spend in these prisons. So which units? So I need somebody to tell me, what are all the units? What do they all look like? What do they all feel like? And then I need to design a sampling strategy around that information. You're not finding that on any DOC website. It's not like I can just go look it up, right? What goes on in unit D? Oh, I think I'll just go Google that, right? It's not there. And then I need to think about shifts. What are the shifts? Who's on those shifts? Which are the coveted shifts? How do people operate? What does it look like? How many people are on each shift? Are they short-staffed? Or do they have enough staff? Are there special training for particular types of officers? And then I need to know the number of staff in general, and I need to know the number of residents on a particular housing unit, and I need to know whether that number is normal or whether it's somehow abnormal. Is it too high? Is it too low? Did they move people? Is there a mix of people in here because something weird happened in another unit and they had to separate people? Like, I don't know. Was there a riot on this unit and everyone's been dispersed? I need all that data. I also can't get that anywhere. I can't just ask for it anywhere on the internet. It doesn't exist. Superintendent is a great place to start, but He's not super helpful. He's really, really busy, or she. It's usually a he, but sometimes a woman. And it's very difficult to get them to know the nitty-gritty day-to-day runnings of a prison. They don't know it. So I can go to the captain, I can go to the deputy super or warden in some places. In my case, it's a super. That's not good enough. And so what I did was I used a contact from the prison project, who's I call him my favorite major. He's since retired. He had said to me, hey, if you ever need anything, call me. I think he was kidding, but I did. I called him and I said, here's what we're doing, right? We want to do this study of RHUs. And this is what I want to do. And I laid it all out for him. And when I got done, it was almost as if you could hear him sort of smirking over the phone. He hadn't made any sound, but I knew he was like secretly making fun of me. I got all done with the talk and he said, you know, Dr. Roods, you can't actually do any of that. And I was like, oh my God, what? So then over a series of conversations, we talked through all of my issues. Now, I didn't tell him which prisons I was considering going to, because if you know anything about prison life, you know these guys move around and they know each other, right? I don't want him to know that I'm going to prison X and then he calls his friend and goes, ooh, she's coming in, get ready, right? I don't want any of that. I don't want him giving me any secret intel. I don't want to violate the confidentiality of my site. I would just want to make sure that I know. So we went over literally every prison. There's over 20 of them in the state, every prison in the state. And he told me what he knew, if anything, about each prison. I talked about various names of units. He told me what they were called and what they meant, what they look like, what the approximate size and space looked like in each of those types of units. He didn't know every prison. He hadn't been to everyone in the state, but he knew enough that then I could create a sampling strategy with my main graduate student, Shannon Magnuson, to be able to put that together. So sampling for me starts at the prison level, but it goes down another 7 or 8 layers, right? And I can't get down any further than maybe 1 or 2 layers without the help of an insider. I can't get it. And the superintendent isn't good enough. And neither is the deputy, and usually neither is the captain. I need a lieutenant, a sergeant, or a major. And unless you've been in that system before, that's pretty difficult, right? It's also easier for me, and I'm just going to put this out there if you're thinking about doing this research, it was easier for me because I already knew him. It would be harder for you to just ask the superintendent to give you a major, and then you're talking to a stranger, right? And he's like, I'm not telling her these things, right? I had already spent time with him. I had several lunches with him. I had emailed back and forth about various things with him. I wouldn't say we were friends, but we were definitely friendly in a way that I felt like I could ask him these questions. So then I get ready and I take my, let me go back one. I take my great idea. I write it all up and I send it to the IRB, right? Awesome. I'm so excited. I've got this insider knowledge. Everything goes out to the IRB. IRB writes me back and politely says, 1, this is not happening. And 2, you're going to need to call us. I've never even had an email from the IRB that said I needed to call them, right? It was so bad that they were like, this is absurd. Call me. So I called the IRB director, who I'd worked with for a long time, but I'd never had a personal conversation with her, right? And she was like, this is not possible. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, this is what the prison needs in order for me to do this. And she was like, basically, hell no. So she made amendments and I went back to my major and he was like, no. And so we went back and forth. I got to say probably 3-4 months between the two of them, what the IRB would accept and what the major thought was possible in those spaces, until we came to a place where both the IRB and the major thought, I think we can make that work, right? Everything's fine. I turn it into the IRB. The IRB gives me approval. The major says, I'm hoping for the best. I think you screwed this up, but go ahead and try, right? Go in. So we go in. So then what does it look like when you go in, right? These decisions are really hard. I have to figure out how to recruit residents and staff, then where I'm going to interview them. Some of this I set up beforehand, but it never, ever works out the way that I planned, right? I have permission to do interviews in spaces A, B, and C. When I get there, A has been turned into something else, B never actually existed in the first place, and C is full of like property that hasn't been distributed to the inmates or the residents yet. And so great, I have no place to interview anyone. I've got a team of 10 people willing to do interviews. So we have to make these accommodations all the time. So one of the accommodations that we made right off the bat, I'm just going to give you one example so you can hear it, but I'm happy to answer questions, is that we wanted to go cell to cell, recruit people at their cells, and then because they're locked down. And then we wanted to have a list of residents that we would have them poll throughout the day. And we wanted them to be brought to spaces that they had told us we could use. the strip search cage, the psychiatric cage. The lieutenant in one place had given up his office for the day. And then there was, I can't remember what the other one was, where the legal team meets and the law library, right? There were places where we could go that they could see us, but not hear us, and we were safe. So I wanted to pull them out, right? And I wanted to go in, actually, I wanted to go in and say like, hey, Natalie, I'd like to interview you. And you'd be like, great, I'd like to interview with you. And so then I'd just pull you out and I'd take you into the space and I'd interview you and then I'd bring you back. And they were like, okay, A, no, you're not moving residents by yourself. And B, we're not doing that one by one. Like, we can't do that. There's 4 people working and there's 400 people in this RHU. We're not pulling them out one by one. So instead, what we had to do was that list approach where we wrote down a list of all the names. But in doing so, I directly violated my IRB, because the IRB, I had promised I wouldn't write down any names. So we made a promise as a research team that we would not put that list down on any tables or chairs. We would not hand that list to any staff members. It would be kept with us. We would write it down just for pulling names, and it would work the same way that it worked if we had to go cell to cell. But it was not what we promised the IRB, and it was not what the prison had said we could do. So we made that decision on the fly. When I got home, I had to file an adverse action with the IRB. I got a little slap on my wrist, told me not to do that again. But after that, they reapproved my IRB protocol to include that, and then began asking me to lecture the IRB prison expert on how to make these accommodations on the IRB side. So not only was I able to do the work in the way that I wanted to, I do have one adverse action of IRB in my file now, which I think is just heinous, but I don't know what to do with that. But I also was able to change the protocol for how we understand prison projects at George Mason, which is where I was formerly employed. We think about confidentiality and safety. We did find out in one of our interview locations, they were putting us in visitation rooms, the little, the partitioned glass rooms where we talk on the telephone. We were doing that in one of them, and the control room had the sound on for one of those. So after that, I stationed a researcher in the control room to be observing the staff member up there during that time, just to make sure that that didn't happen again. So one of my research team would just sit in the control room all day while we were doing interviews to make sure he never actually turned on that intercom button, so he couldn't hear any of the interviews. And so what happens in all of this, and it's a long story, but I want to make sure that you understand all the nuance of this work, is that I end up paying enormous attention to the needs of the institution and the people who work in it. I pay enormous attention to what the residents would like, or what would help make them feel safe, or what would help make them feel heard. And I also do that around my research team, right? What do they need to be comfortable in this space? What do they need to get? And what happens is, when you do all this work, it takes forever, and it's not ideal on the tenure track, right? You're like, I need pubs this year, and I just spent an entire year on the phone with these people, right? That's not going to work out. It doesn't also work on grant timelines either, right? This is all going to be done before you even submit the grant application. Can't even, because if you try to do it in the first 2 months that you gave yourself on your grant timeline, it's never going to get done. It can't work like that. You got to have this all prepped before it starts. What happens though is the data yield that we get from people is unreal. The conversations that we have and the way that they talk to us in those spaces, the way that they follow up with us, the letters that we receive afterward with even more data than we've even asked for is unparalleled. I've never experienced anything like it. So it's worth it, but it's a challenge. We also have to pay attention to trauma, right? So primarily, I think I've done the opposite of what many qualitative researchers have done. I've been more focused on the trauma to my team than on the trauma to my, I'm going to call them subjects just for a second, although I hate that, to the people I'm interviewing. My research team, I'm really concerned about. I use a large team of researchers, and I'm going to give you an overview of what the whole project methods look like in just a second. But I use the large team that includes undergraduates, graduate students, sometimes postdocs, and by graduate students, I mean both master's and PhD students, and then also colleagues of mine at the professorial level. I really get concerned. Maybe it's because maybe I'm too matriarchal or motherly. Don't hate me for that, but I really get concerned about my undergrads. They've never experienced anything like this, and I usually bring a pretty large team of them in with us. Both of the years of the RHU study, we had a team of 6 undergraduate researchers, so we've had 12 of them with us over the, well, actually, and 1 volunteer, so 13 of them over the years. It makes me very nervous to bring them into those spaces. I imagine phone calls from their parents, right? Are you kidding? Why did you bring my daughter into a maximum security unit, into a restricted housing space, right? So I'm really careful about their trauma, what they have experienced. We do a lot of prep work, training them and getting them ready for the space. We make sure they understand all the university resources for counseling and for assistance if they have any challenges. We also make sure that on the team, we talk about counseling and therapy as a normative part of school life and of research life. So the grad students often volunteer that they are in therapy themselves, or they have been to counseling before. I do as well, so that it just seems like everybody does it, right? It's not a thing that you have to shun or shy away from. It's all part of what we experience as researchers. I tell them a story about how hard being in a female prison hit me the first time. I'd never seen anything like that. I cried for days. I've never been depressed, I don't think. And that was definitely a small bout of depression or sadness after that. And I tell them that story about how I did not expect it. And it hit me like a wave and I couldn't get out of bed for a few days. We talk about it. We also talk about them not having to share their trauma, but just to share that the experience felt burdensome or troubling to them. And to let them know that if they have experienced any sexual trauma, physical trauma, verbal trauma or abuse, that if any of that comes up in an interview that they are interviewing, it is never data at any cost for us. It is always people, right? And so if for any reason they can't continue an interview, they just need to excuse themselves from the interview temporarily and come find somebody else, and we just sub for in it for each other. And they just take a time out and we explain to them where to go and what to do during that space. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the residents and staff, though. I wasn't thinking about resident and staff trauma or re-trauma from the asking of the questions that we ask. And so we've begun, I wouldn't say we're good at it yet, but my graduate student, Shannon Magnuson, she's not my graduate student anymore. She's Dr. Magnuson. I can't call her that anymore. I should correct myself. Was adamant that I stop focusing exclusively on the research team and focus on the people we're talking to. And she actually brought a trauma expert into one of our team meetings. And we spent the better part of an hour, hour and a half, listening to the various parts of trauma, the various ways that trauma manifests, what it looks like, how people can experience it, and how to not fully avoid, but how to mitigate concern that you might have about re-traumatizing or traumatizing people through the way or the how that you ask the questions. And so we've begun that process. I'm going to say that we are a work in progress. Okay, we also use team science, and I'm going to put this out there to you, although you may not choose this. I know as an ethnographer, this might sound totally whack, right? Most ethnographers are lone wolves. They do it on their own. They do their own thing. I'm a team girl. I like to have a really large team of people around me. And so you'll see in a minute, there were dozens of them working on the restricted housing unit studies. My statement to my team is always, it takes many brains, right? None of us is as smart as all of us, right? We just all sort of feed off of each other. It creates a very collaborative space for undergrads and graduate students and me. It also allows for some amazing mentorship between people. Certain people have certain expertise or certain ideas about something. It doesn't matter what your seniority is, you can still learn something. I think in my last example, I told you that my graduate student corrected me for not having enough focus on trauma. I'm okay with that. Like, bring it. I want that in that space. And that's exactly what I want in a team science approach. So we study team science. We take the approach very seriously. It's very collaborative. We try to find ways to take less and to give more to each other and to the people that we're studying. In prisons, it's really difficult. You're not allowed to give them like cookies. Can't bring in pens, certainly not. You can't do anything for them, really. And so we've crafted ways, and I can talk about this in the Q&A, to give back to them in a variety of ways that I think are useful. Not awesome, but useful. So let me just give you an overview of what this looks like so that you can just wrap your head around what the data looks like. If you've ever seen me at a conference, I'm sorry again, because this is the same data slide that we always use for the prison project, and the solitary confinement one looks just like this one. I'll do them back to back so you can see them. The prison project was 4 male prisons and 2 female prisons that I explained to you. It was 3 medium, 2 maximum, 1 medium. Sorry, I made a mistake earlier. I said it was 2, 2, and 2. It's 3, 2, and 1. We had a team of 1 undergrad on that project because that was pre my undergraduate focus. 2 masters, 3 PhDs, 2 postdocs, a faculty, and 2 researchers. They're just full-time researchers for their center where I work. We spent about 945 data collection hours in the field, and we went to all 3 shifts. We did not go to the 4th shift. We spent 3 days in each prison. In total, it was about 15% of the staff 199 interviews and 385 surveys, and then over 1,600 surveys for the residents. And I can't see it because my head's in the way. 148 resident interviews. This study took us about 3.5 years, even though it's only 3 days in 6 prisons. It takes a long time to schedule these visits, and it wasn't uncommon for us to have to reschedule. Something happened, they were locked down, they couldn't help us, there was too much snow, right? There's all kinds of problems going into prisons, and so we often had to cancel trips or rearrange trips, but we did make them work. One thing I want to say about this project in terms of a boost for team science, it is very hard in the world of criminology to get qualitative work published. It's less hard in Law and Society, thank goodness. Another reason why I wanted to give this talk today, because I love the Law and Society Association. Less hard in sociology, but very hard in criminology. It's getting easier, I'd say, on a slow uptick, but it's hard. And one of the main reasons is because qualitative methods is not commonly taught as a core course in criminology PhD programs. I haven't looked recently, but I think there are only 2 programs in the country that have it as a required course. Many criminology programs have it as an optional course, a special topics course, but as a mandatory course, it doesn't come up very often. So what that means is that you've got a whole bunch of people in the field reviewing articles that don't know a lot about qualitative methods. If you remember your research methods class, you probably know you spent 13 weeks studying quantitative methods and you had that 1 cursory week on qual methods, right? And now you're expected to do reviews of journal articles and you don't understand what any of the language means or what it looks like. One way that in my pre-tenure years that I sort of strategized to get through that process, and this may be a little bit of me selling my soul, so don't tell any hardcore ethnographers that I did this. One way that I did this is the team science approach, right? When you see 945 hours of field work, don't you feel like that's rigorous? You do, right? When you see 385 surveys or 1,600 surveys, 199 interviews, 148 interviews, that feels like a lot. But if you pulled out the interviews that I did for that study, you might have gotten 10 and 8, right? Because I had such a big team. We combine our research together and we all ask the same interview questions and we all did these interviews together and the data becomes one big data set. And it means that I can claim a higher level of rigor to people who don't understand qualitative rigor, who don't understand qualitative work like words like saturation, right? I can get it through numbers as opposed to having to get it through something else. It is a little bit of a sellout, but it's the way that I navigated tenure to be able to get through in the area of scholarship that I found myself working. Okay, so then the second one looks a lot the same, but I'll give you a little bit of a different story. So these are 2 studies, Together Alone and Changing the Whole Mind. Because no one had done on the ground work inside solitary confinement or restricted housing unit space qualitatively for a very, very, very long time, it's rare that researchers get the kind of access that we got. We decided to go in pretty umbrella for the first study. Very big questions, right? Like, how do you define risk? What does risk feel like to you? When do you feel at risk? Tell me what makes you feel risky. Have you ever made anyone feel at risk? What does that feel like, right? Those sort of questions. Risk, punishment, reforms or changes, big umbrella questions, right? From that data, though, we narrowed it down to another round of much more focused questions for changing the whole mind. And we were able to go in and ask a better set of questions the second time. So the Together Alone data is super helpful for understanding the land. It's not super helpful for understanding the nuance. The Changing the Whole Mind data is much better for getting at the nuance around the topics that we asked about. This time we went to 1 male facility twice, that's that gold one, 4 different other male facilities, and 1 female facility twice. Turns out that there's only a handful of people in one of the female prisons in this state in their RHU, and it wasn't worth our time to drive all that way to interview 4 people. So we just went back to the one that had more people in it because we wanted females. By the time we got to Changing the Whole Mind, we realized that the females need a study of their own. Female restricted housing units don't look anything like male restricted housing units. There are far less people in there. What they go in for is totally different. The way they're treated is totally different. It's a different beast. So by the time we went back for round 2, we kept the male data in those 4 prisons sort of as their own entity, and we sort of let the other institutions slide. Together alone, we went into all 4 shifts. We even stayed overnight. We were doing about 16 hours a day when we were doing that field work. But it turns out that in restricted housing units, there's only 2 or maybe 3 people working in the RHU from the 10 to 6 shift. So we would hold 2 of the researchers back. Myself and Shannon typically would stay back for the 10 to 6 shift. And we'd interview the 3 people and we'd watch their residents sleep. And then we'd go to the hotel and pick up the rest of the people to go back for the next day. And it wasn't really that helpful. It turned out that the people working on that shift also had previously worked on both of the other shifts, or all three of the other shifts. And they were kind of interchangeable in that way. And they weren't saying anything so different. So we decided on the second study to cut out the 3rd shift. It wasn't really that valuable. This time we brought in a bigger team. We did about 1,600 hours worth, almost 1,700 hours worth of field work. All in all, we interviewed about 62% of all staff working in these prisons, RHUs. And I can't see because my head's in the way, about 26% of all the residents. Sorry, gotta move myself around. One of the other things I want to say about team facilitation is that our questionnaire starts with my questions, right? Because I'm the lead researcher. So with the team, usually the team was Shannon and me for a long time, right? We came up with a series of questions or focal areas. We don't have a list of questions. We just have things we want to talk about on a list. Those go first. Shannon needed a dissertation. So she decided to do her dissertation inside the restricted housing units, but she wanted to do it specifically on mental health. So she did her dissertation questions next, right? So we asked those questions too. Then the undergraduates were working in teams of 2 with their own questions around their own studies. So we put their questions on the list, right? So each team got to, I think, throw on 1 or 2 topic areas. So those go on the list. My colleagues who study exclusively critical race and gender studies, they wanted to ask questions around race and gender issues. And so they put their questions on the list. So now we have a list of, I'm saying questions, but again, I mean focal areas. We memorize it. Every one of us memorizes it. Some of the undergrads take in a sort of cheat sheet so that they can help remind themselves what they're supposed to ask. Most of us memorize it. And we don't do interviews. We hold conversations with people. So we sit down and we chat for about an hour, sometimes 45 minutes. Sometimes I go long, like an hour and a half. And we sit and we ask them questions and we run through these topics in our head. And we let the people talking to us talk about whatever it is they want to talk about. And then we maneuver them toward the subjects that we want to make sure that we touch on. But we also let them take the conversation in different ways so that it isn't a conversation led by me about things that I'm interested in. It's a conversation where I bring up topics and they can respond or not, and they can bring up topics and I can then follow through with prompts or not, right? Depending on how interested I am. Same way that you would do at a coffee shop or at a bar. If you were talking to somebody, you'd start talking about something and then they'd say something and that would spark something in you and then you go, right? It's a pretty interesting method. David Snow at UC Irvine wrote an article once about this method, or what looks similar to this method. He calls it interviewing by comment. And I think it's a pretty interesting approach to getting really good data, especially with vulnerable populations, making them feel like they have a participatory stake in the types of things that you're talking to them about. It also means that right before COVID, my research team finished data collection in December. The world locked down in March. It was not COVID was awesome, but the timing was awesome. It meant that we spent the better part of a year then coding that data, and we've been writing ever since. So since then, we've produced, I think, 3 or 4 articles, a book chapter, and a book, right? And we have another 10 or 12 articles all in the works coming out of that data. I think we've gotten 2 undergraduate theses, 3 master's theses, 1 PhD, and several more just projects, right? And my book, all out of that data. And we're not even close to done. There's still so much more we can do with that data. It means that everybody wins, right? And I have that data set available for more, right? It's still there. You can carve out a piece of it. You can take just the disciplinary custody in residence, or the folks who are, you could just take a particular racial category or particular gender category. We wrote a chapter for the DCS volume at ASC on trans and LGBTQ in restricted housing units. You can sort of take that out and make, actually it's producing a second book because my colleagues are now, their book should be coming out in the fall. It's called Down in the Hole. It looks at specifically at race and restricted housing units. Just really interesting stuff. And it allows for what I think is a fair trade between the researchers and the prisons that we're asking for so much, right? I'm asking them for their time, for their space, for their accommodations, for their trust that my research team isn't going to screw up while we're in there. We're not going to hurt anyone. We're not going to break any rules. We're not going to allow ourselves to get hurt. We're not going to also propose to do some sort of expose about them at the end where we write up all the horrible things that we saw while we were in there. We're going to give fair and equitable treatment to that data. If we do it in days of 2, and then the second project was 4, and we have 10 researchers going in at a time, collecting data in one restricted housing unit in one prison over 4 days, that means that of the other over 300 and whatever 48 days a year, they don't have to bother with us. But I've got enough data now as a researcher to do everything I've ever wanted to do over the next 10 years. And I can go back in with another study if I want to. I also don't have to. And it means that what they've given to me, I've taken full advantage of. And I thank them profusely, and then I don't bug them again for a while. I don't need to go in there every week, right? I can get it all done if I'm efficient. And I think about those things. The empath in me doesn't want to take more than I give. And in prisons, you're always taking more than you're giving, and it feels hard. Okay. All of that to say that my team is not even close to perfect. We absolutely screw it up. Every time we have a meeting, somebody goes, why didn't we ask this? And I'm like, okay, that's my fault. Or why didn't we do this, right? It's always my fault. We don't get it right. The data is flawed in so many ways. The study was flawed. We didn't do a great job. We did a good job. I'm so proud of it, but it's not great. And each time I think we get better and better and better, but I think learning from experience makes it better. And each time the data is better, and I feel better about the way that we collected it and the methods in which my team is working with each other to help protect each other's sort of sanity and safety as we go through the process. Okay, so we published a bunch. There's stuff out there. The reason I wanted to put this up there is the one on the right-hand side, the Sociology Compass piece. Probably not a place, although I love Sociology Compass, it's not super famous and people don't always go there. This was the piece that they asked us to write about organizational culture, and Shannon and I decided to write about the multitude of cultures in carceral spaces. And we did it as a methodological piece. So we did it not only about culture, which is the org side, which is what Sociology Compass wanted from us. We also added a methodological side, which is some of what I've been talking about here today. The idea of cultures being very different from unit to unit, from shift to shift, from person to person within a carceral space. And so if you're looking to find the written version or a written version of methods that would go along with my talk, that would be where to go, right? You can pull directly from that to be able to piece together what your own methods would look like if you were going to do qualitative work inside a setting. I also put these other ones up here not to showcase my own work, but to tell you that the methods in each of these is challenging and cool, right? And so the other one I want to point out is the sex logics piece that we punished. Maybe I felt like it was punishment. We published in Punishment and Society. The reason why I wanted to point this one out is because my research approach, again, is conversational and topical, right? Not a list of questions, not a questionnaire, not I have to go in order, not generalizable, not anything close, right? Not that, not even objective, right? It is subjective based on who I'm talking to and who's talking to them. The reason why this piece is interesting is because this piece is about the Prison Rape Elimination Act. This is from the Prison Project data. We did not ask a single question about the Prison Rape Elimination Act, not one. There were no focal areas on PREA, nothing. It came up organically, repeatedly from staff and from residents during the time that we were doing our field work. Now, part of that is timing, because we were doing field work right as that state was officially implementing, long past when PREA passed, but right when that was officially sort of implementing, but also that was what was on their mind. And the research approach allowed for that organic sort of emergent data to come forward. And it ended up being the first and I think the only peer-reviewed piece that we have out of that data, because it was the most compelling story to tell. It was the story we never even asked for. And so I think that's a pretty interesting piece when you're thinking about how you're doing your work. And then just quick thanks. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm going to thank most profusely Shannon Magnuson, my former doctoral student, who has been my right-hand awesome guru of everything since she became my student many, many years ago, and is also a co-author on the book with me, along with Angela Hattery, and then the DOC and all of the residents and staff who I don't know why they talk to, I know why the residents talk to us because they're bored and we give them something to do. I don't know why the staff eventually agree to talk to us, but I appreciate it. And then everyone else who's helped us along the way. So thank you very, very much for that. And then just my thank you to all of you for listening. And I wanted to make sure that we left enough time for Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So if everyone can join me with a virtual round of applause for that fantastic talk.
Thank you.
So we have time for a Q&A. I have lots of questions, but I want to start with questions from the floor if anyone has one. So as a reminder, we are recording. So if you don't want to ask your question and be on camera potentially, you can put your question in the chat. Otherwise, you can raise your virtual hand. You can put your name in the chat and I can call on you. But we have a number of ways to do that. So anyone want to go first? Okay, I will ask one of my questions. Let me pull up my list.
Your questions are hard. I don't want your questions.
No, I'm just building on things that I'll leave my hard question for the end.
I'm just kidding.
I just want to build on things that you said. I was super curious to hear more about some things. So two questions, and you can choose which one, if any, you respond to. One is, I was curious how you funded this, given the difficulty of grant management. Like, as you mentioned, like this doesn't work with a grant like timeline. So given like the difficulty of grant management with the unwieldy, uncontrollable timeline of prison work, I was curious how you did fund it. And then my other question is, I wanted to hear more about the points of conflict between the IRB and what the major thought would work. So we heard about the list thing that came up during field work, but I was curious like what the major wanted you to do and then what the IRB said no to before you even started doing field work. So those are two questions if you want. And it looks like we do have another question coming in from Joss. So either you can answer those or I can read Joss's question.
Okay, let me just, these are, I think the funding one is really quick. It's very difficult to get funding in from the feds for strictly qualitative work, right? So we went after it and got denied every single time. So we decided to just get creative, right? I'm an ethnographer. I can probably do a 3-year study with $100 and a tank of gas. I can make it work. Every one of my graduate students is willing to do the work, usually for free, which I don't want them to do. But if it means they're getting theses or dissertations, they can do independent studies with me. They can find a way to do the work. We can do it on their off days. We can do it on, whatever they need to be able to make it work with their full-time GRAs or with their classes or whatever they need. Undergraduates are really easy because I can get them at Mason, I could get them as work study students. They had a research option for work study. I can get them as volunteers in my research lab. They love volunteer hours, and who doesn't want to go into solitary confinement and collect data? And I can also get them for course credit. So can get really creative. So what we did was we applied for internal funding at George Mason for, I think 3 or 4 different times. 2 of the summers were fully funded. All 6 undergrads were paid 40 hours a week at a pretty high pay rate. It was comparable to what my grad students were making, honestly. And I was like, dang, that's a lot of money. And it gave me and one of my grad students a small stipend. Those are called summer impact grants at Mason, and they come through the undergraduate creative activities research scholarship office. If you have them, that might be useful. I know Sam Houston, where I am now, they also have something like that. It's called FAST, I think, over the summer, where you can take summer students with you, but we don't have a stitch of funding other than what we got from George Mason University. And then my graduate student, Shannon, actually got some funding for her dissertation. And because she wanted the team to come and help her collect that data for a bigger data yield, she would often pay for a few motel rooms, or she'd pay for a dinner out one night through that funding for the team, right? So that everybody could go with her. And so we were able to piece together with her funding and my funding the ability to bring people up there. It's not expensive. We'd rent a van, we'd put 8 people in a van, two people would drive separately, we'd drive up, we'd stay. It wasn't pretty, right? We'd stay 4 to 5 people to a room. Shannon sometimes slept on the floor. At one time we didn't have blankets for her. We just put our coats on her and she slept with coats. But you're not there that often, right? You're there for like 6 hours and then you're back in prison for another 12 to 16 hours, right? And we eat at the prison for free. we try to make the funding work, but we probably did the whole thing on, I mean, we got good money from the university, but if you don't count this undergraduates, I bet you the whole thing happened for less than a couple $1,000 bucks. We didn't need a lot of money to do the work. We just
Wow.
had to get creative and we had to volunteer.
Awesome. Thank
You
you.
want to do Joss's question before I do
Yeah.
points of conflict? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So Joss is asking if you could speak more about this issue of how to take less and give more in carceral settings.
Mhm. It's super hard. I think one way is to be, I mean, you know, the obvious ways, right? One way is to be incredibly respectful. One way is to not, for the staff, let's do staff first, right? So for staff, one way is to be flexible, right? To work within the parameters that they will allow in their space. And they're all different. They all have the same DOC in my state that I go to. They all have the same institutional policies, but they all interpret those very different. So even though the policy says X, it doesn't look the same. No matter which prison you go to, it looks differently. So I don't make assumptions about how things run in a particular prison. I immediately ask for debriefings, right? Before I go in, I get those debriefings about what it looks like in there and what we can expect. And then I train my team. So if all prisons want you to stand against a wall when a resident is walking by, for example, or not wear provocative clothing, right? Or not wear open-toed shoes, or not use swear words. Certain prisons don't like you to use those sort of words. In prison, we refer to the residents as inmates when staff are around, because that's what they call them. But when we talk to the residents individually, we refer to them by the last name that is on their shirt, because that humanizes them, right? So I think for staff, it's about knowing the rules and operating within them, and not having to have them constantly remind you that you're screwing it up, right? If you're, chatting in the hallway and you're talking it up and you're laughing, and the residents are trying to get by and they won't cross by you because you're not paying attention, like, you can't have that. I can't have that. We barely speak to each other when we're in there. We follow the rules as if we were in prison too, so that everything runs smoothly. And I think the staff really appreciate that. The other big way, and this was Shannon again, I'm going to give her full props. We can't give them anything. We can't send them anything. We can't bring them anything. We can't give them anything. And so we thought long and hard about writing a thank you note, right? Seems ridiculous, but okay, that's the best we can do. We can write a thank you note. And Shannon was like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to draft an individual thank you note that thanks individual people who we think went above and beyond to help us during their time there. We're going to thank as many of them as possible on the staff side. And we are going to CC the director of research and the secretary of corrections and the superintendent of that institution every time we send it directly to the prison. And it is phenomenal. They cannot believe it. You wouldn't believe the emails we get back. No one has ever thanked us before. Or, oh my God, you CC'd the secretary of corrections. He must know that we're doing a good job. Thank you so much. Like, they're just pleading with us for, like, gushing with awesome thank you for us, right? And it took us an hour to craft a really cool letter. It's not a form letter. It's a letter that Shannon meticulously drafts to every institution that specifically names not people we interviewed with necessarily, but the people who helped us navigate, and then names units or teams so that we can maintain their confidentiality. It's very sticky and gracious and, like, profusely, profoundly thankful. And we do it on purpose so that they feel thankful. For the residents, we have promised them to provide them with an executive level report, and this is a failure on our part. The state that I work in wants to be able to see that executive level one pager that we'd like to send back to the residents and approve it before we send it out, and they have yet to approve it. And it's, what, 10 years post the first study that I did there, and 5 or 6 years post those solitary confinement studies. So the residents, what we do for them is we include my mailing address, my university mailing address, on every recruitment flyer, and we tell them that they can write to us with more information or any reason, and we will write back to them. We are not allowed to become their pen pals. We cannot comment on anything specific, and we can't give any legal advice, but we will 100% acknowledge every piece of mail that comes to us with a letter that goes back to them. And another student of mine, Bryce, writes those letters back to them, addressed with the resident's name, it's a pretty standard, we have a bunch of standard formatted, sort of thank you so much, hope everything's going well, blah, blah, blah. And then it's signed from the team. And so it may not be a lot, but from what I've heard from them, they are very grateful to, one, know that the letter reached us and someone read it. And two, they're incredibly grateful to get mail. And so it is a bit of a thank you that we can't correspond with them as like friends, but we can let them know that we got it. In most cases, when they send mail, they get nothing in response. And so this is a cool interaction, minimal interaction and response that we can do that makes them feel like they've been heard.
Thank you. So we have another question from Natalie. Natalie, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I like had like this whole list, but now like all I can think about is like this scene that you've set and like of just like multiple students, grad students and your team like sleeping in the same hotel room. And I have like half of the Washington team is in the Zoom room with me for this. And I'm reflecting about like when we do field work, we get our own hotel rooms, which is like really nice for us to like decompress individually. But part of what's so productive for us as the team is like the drives back from prisons, which are often quite far removed from a hotel room. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about like, as I like process like my like trauma reaction to having to share a hotel room with like 4 or 5 other students, like the flip side of it is like, what's the data value of that? Because our car rides are so productive for us to process and make sense. So I'm wondering, as an ethnographer and a team of ethnographers, do you capitalize on being just like with each other all the time? And like, what's your process of documenting, recording, and then analyzing all of that sort of downtime in between the actual data collection of having these semi-structured conversations with folks?
Okay, 2 things. I think I tried to work this into the talk, but I was already too long and I was like, I'm just gonna get out. So I think 2 things. One, we do take power differentials into account when making those hotel reservations, or motel, I should say. I can't say hotel with a straight face, it's ridiculous. Motel reservations. We also take gender and comfort level into, right? If we have trans, or if we have, I mostly have a female team, but sometimes I get males on the team, and what do we do with, right, we don't mix them, obviously, right? So we try to make sure that they're all comfortable, unless they're comfortable, and then we're like, I don't care, right, whatever you want. So the undergrads tend to be bunked together, right? We put them in rooms to their own. The newer graduate students or grad students that I don't have a built relationship with, maybe the ones that are still taking coursework or something like that, if I can, I'll put them in their own room, and then I will room with the more senior level grad students who are, I feel like, are basically my colleagues anyway, right? It doesn't always work out that way. I think Shannon, I don't know if she's on the call, but if she were on the call, she would say, I roomed with you in my first year, right? Like, we didn't have any options. We had no money. And so we just, it was that's what we did. And so we explained beforehand, if anyone was uncomfortable, we could try to make different arrangements. Everybody, it was fine. We did it. It was fine. It was weird, but it was fine. So we do take those things into account. And my colleagues who are doing the race study, they're actually married colleagues. So they get their own, they don't sleep with anyone else. Like, it's just them. So that's important. I think I was going to say this, and this is a hard one for me. I wrestle with this, but so we're in prison all day long. Let's say we do 8 to 10 hours on a shorter day, right? 8 to 10 hours. We usually have car ride up, where we're talking about what to expect, right? Because we usually go up the morning of, save a motel night. Then we leave at like 3, 4 in the morning, so we can get up there by 8 or 7 or whatever time we're entering. Then we do all day in prison, and we do not talk about our field work while we're in the prison. No one talks about, oh, we just had this really cool interview. Nothing like that, right? Because who knows who's listening? None of that. Then when we go to lunch that day, we spend lunch together in the staff dining room, usually is where they let us eat. There isn't a lot of talk about what we've heard or seen, because there are listening ears everywhere. It's just sort of like, hey, this has been fun, or, what did you do last night, or whatever, that kind of stuff. We go back and finish the day, and then that night we go out to dinner. And by dinner, I really just mean we have greasy bar food, because these towns don't have a lot of great places to eat. It is a tough haul for me on the trauma response side, right? Because part of me wants to debrief. We call them debriefings, where people can talk about their responses to what they've seen or what they've heard for the day. As an ethnographer, though, that is a disaster. I do not want you to talk about your field work until you have written your notes. Because the minute you start talking about your field work, like imagine Ashley and I did field work all day together, and we go to Starbucks after and we start talking about it. Now what's inside my head is not pure, clean data. It's pure, clean data that I then retold to Ashley. Ashley interpreted whatever she wanted to say about it and told it back to me. And now when I record that field note, it's no longer data. It's data embedded with Ashley. And I don't want that. I want pure, clean data. And then we debrief about the data. So you have to record your field notes before I will talk to you about them. If you had a particular thing that happened, like, you know, for example, sometimes guys will put their hands in their lap and get a little aggressive with themselves. And my students get very uncomfortable. We train them how to deal with it, right? How do you handle this situation? But it happens. And so they'll bring that up. Instead of describing the scene to me and going through all of they will just say that that thing happened, and we will process the response to the action, but we don't process the note version of what that will look like when they type it, because I don't want everybody in the room to infiltrate my data, the data that we're going to get from somebody's field notes. So then we go back to the hotel room. The grad students are together, the undergrads are together. We usually have you know, enough beds or desk spaces, or we can find a local coffee shop, or we can go down to the lobby, and we can all find a place to cup a squat and type as much as possible before we're too tired and go to bed. We do hand take notes as much as possible. And on the breaks that we have, and if you've done prison field work, you know, there are lots of breaks because we can't interview anyone during count time, and we can't interview anyone during lunch, and we can't, right? So we're writing, full handwriting, as many notes as we can so that we have it. We type as much as possible. We go back in for day 2. We do the same thing for 4 days straight. Then we take all those notes back, we type them all up, and then after field work is over, we do a full debrief. And that way we don't mix together the debriefing or trauma response stuff with the notes. But it is a hard play. The team, I think, knows that if they have something in particular that harmed them or that they just need to talk about, they know who to go to, right? Typically it's Shannon. She's closer in age to them and they adore her. Sometimes it's me. They want an authority figure, somebody to talk to. Sometimes it's each other. It's one of the other great reasons to pair them together. The undergrads at the end of a day are all in a room together, and they can talk to each other in a way that they can't talk to their professor or their grad student mentor. And so we try to find ways to make sure that they have room to do that. We also train them to go to the staff bathroom. At any point during field work, they can say they have to go to the bathroom, and they could be in there for an hour if they needed to be. Like, I'll cover for them. They just need to tell me where they are so that if I'm looking for them, I'm like, oh my God, Ashley's missing, right? I can't have that. I just need to know where you are, and you can be gone for as long as you want. You don't even have to come back. If you need to leave, you need to leave. Like, I'll find somebody to escort you out, and you no longer have to stay. So we make it work as best as we can, but I'm trying to find a better way. Natalie, if you have better ideas, I'm way open.
No, I mean, it's so interesting to hear like the reveal of the curtain behind how other teams function. And like it's so different from our experience. Gabby, who's in the Zoom room, we just got back from a trip out to Washington like 2 weeks ago. And it's just, so we're still processing all of the things that like happened to us and we saw. So it's just great timing to hear another model.
I think it's awesome. It's one of the reasons why I constantly talk to CareMet. Right? Or not as much lately, but when we were in the field, I run panels together every year, right? Because I want to hear what you guys are doing. And the same thing with Kevin Wright's team, doing very similar team in Arizona, right? It's why I invite the ASU students to present with us so often, because I think we're all doing really similar stuff, different questions, different ideas, but in the same spaces. And we're doing them in really different ways. And I think the method stuff, we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, so have you all written up like about teamwork specifically? Because we wrote that piece in Prison Stories about team research in carceral settings. Have you all, or do you know if Kevin's team has written specifically about the dynamics of teamwork?
We're writing a reflective piece for the new DCS volume. It'll just be a short one, like a 5,000 worder or so, and it's going to be more about sort of collaborative research instead of it's the title of this talk, right? The with your subjects as opposed to on them. The idea of collaborating with individuals, it's less about the way that our team functions, but you'll find it smattered throughout that organizational cultures piece that I mentioned in Sociology Compass. I think Shannon and I wrote another chapter that has it in there. We wrote a piece on practitioner partnerships a while ago. Like, you'll find it in bits and pieces.
Yeah. Cool. All right, thanks. I was just on a
wrap up question.
Yeah,
great. Melissa, you want to go ahead?
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for this talk. We're editing a paper currently that's on some of these methodological questions and like drawing boundaries and kind of the implications of kind of our experiences in the field for then how we write and what we write. So this is super timely.
Good.
But I went to ASA and I went to a panel that was around the ethics of care in field research. And one of the panelists brought up this issue or strategy, I should say, of bringing in someone to talk about trauma and how to identify trauma and how that can inform the work that we do. And so I'm curious how that experience was for your team and what strategies they suggested for the team to learn how to identify and manage trauma while in the field.
It was new to me. I mean, we have Shannon wanted to start a solitary confinement research group, right? An RHE research group with all the people that had worked with us or were working with us on papers. And so I was like, great, right? And in addition to our team and our training and our whatever else, she wanted to just talk. And so we met once a month for an hour or two. And the main reason she wanted to start, I think, I don't want to speak for her, but was she wanted us to all craft positionality statements because we wanted to understand better the dynamics of our team in order to be able to understand how we were thinking and how we were conducting research or whatever. And I'd never even heard of a positionality statement, right? I'm like, okay, who's the professor now? Clearly it's not me, right? My students are brilliant. So I was like, okay, that's awesome. I don't even know what that is. So, but it took us a long time. We still haven't written them. It's been, a while. We haven't met in a while, but she was finishing her dissertation and defending last spring. So we took a little break so she could get through it. But that was hard. I thought it was just going to be like, okay, great. Tell us how to do it. We'll do it. Turned out there was a lot to discuss about what positionality means and what that means to each of us and how we understand each idea of positionality. So we worked through that. And then we went to one of the meetings one day and we needed a break from positionality because we were getting run down, like trying to work through all the things that were paining us, I think. And Shannon said she was going to bring this trauma expert. And this woman has worked in trauma care. I think I'm going to say she's a psychologist, but she may have been a psychiatrist. And she has specific training in trauma, I'm going to say trauma care, basically, like helping people who've experienced trauma, but she's also worked with research teams on helping them figure out ways not to re-traumatize. And for carceral spaces, I think if I remember, it's been a while since we did this, but I don't remember her having a lot of expertise in carceral spaces, but she often worked with, for example, victims of sexual abuse, and you're trying to interview them about their sexual trauma, right? That can't be good. And so how are you able to navigate that? And I don't recall, I would have to, if you send me an email afterward, I can ask Shannon if it's okay if I share with you the name of that woman, because Shannon just knows her personally and brought her onto our call. But she was amazing. Like, we peppered her with research related questions around prisons. And her responses were things like, I don't know anything about prison, but here's what I think. And every time it was mind blowing, like, oh my God, we could totally do that, right? Like, it was just, and the team took notes, and I'd have to look through the Dropbox folder to remember all of the tips and tricks that she was responding to. But there are lots of people now, I would be careful. There are lots of people now who think they're experts in trauma informed care, who really just got like a 4-hour PowerPoint and decided they were going to be an expert in trauma informed care. I would look for somebody who, and trauma is not a specialty, a psychiatric specialty, right? So that you can like, hey, I got my degree in trauma. Like, it's not, you have to find somebody who's actually had additional training or understands this work or has done it. But if you can find someone like that to come and talk to your team, even just to brainstorm, they don't have to do a formal presentation. If I recall, she didn't do maybe a half hour. And then the better part of an hour was spent with us just talking to her. Like, when this happens, what would we do? When this happens, what would we do? And she was just so incredibly helpful. I was grateful for that. So I don't think I can answer your question point by point, but I think I can help you find someone who can.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine. But I think it's just an interesting concept to think about in continuing, not even just work within carceral settings, but just working with very heavily marginalized and traumatized populations.
Agree.
How do we think about how to not re-traumatize? But then also for us, like, sometimes we come to this work because we've had these very traumatic and lived experiences with the criminal system. And so we get triggered too. And so
agree. It's a balance.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. And it's definitely made me think a lot about how to pursue this in the future.
Thank you.
Awesome. Gabriella, do you want to go ahead?
Gabby.
Hi, Danielle. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while. So This has all been really interesting. As Melissa and Natalie shared, we're still working with Karamet. We're still kind of in the mix of field work, trying to transition from that to going back to teaching in a couple of weeks. But I was curious, you talked about a lot of like the background work, right, that goes into setting up the project and how kind of that just takes a lot of time, and sometimes grant funders or even department chairs, right, don't understand that. But I was curious about, we've talked about in our team about this concept of like shared ethics and ethics negotiations, and we've talked about some of the like renegotiations that have to happen for us on the ground as non-PI team members, right? Like Karamet might go in, she might have a plan with her gatekeeper, her contact person, but then when we're on the ground, right, when we're trying to secure a private place, we also sometimes have to renegotiate that with staff that are on the ground, uniform staff that weren't involved in those conversations.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you had experienced that with your team, and if your graduate students or undergrads had kind of had to go through similar experiences, and how it was that you kind of navigated those positions. Because specifically Melissa and I have talked about is, right, is as grad student, you don't want to jeopardize the project, or we were at the time, luckily we're now have real jobs, but you don't want to jeopardize the project for the PI, and you don't want to compromise, right, access to these spaces that are closed off from a lot of the general public. So yeah, I was just curious if that had happened at all, and if you could talk a little bit about how you all addressed it.
Yeah, it happens pretty regularly. I mean, I think they're put in situations where they have to renegotiate things when they're on the ground. I think I'm going to go back to the team science approach, because I know that, I don't know if you guys use a team science approach in its form, but you are a team. So I think the way that we do it is Shannon and me usually, I mean, this is just this project. Shannon's now graduated. It won't be a Shannon and Danielle team anymore because she has her own life now, but this project was Shannon and me, right? So we worked together to do everything, and those decisions were jointly made. I mean, I was the faculty member, so if there had to be a hard line decision, it came from me, but Shannon and I negotiated all those decisions, and the team knew that we were sort of the people in charge. I never send my team into the field without either Shannon or me present. My team doesn't go off on their own, right? We're with them. We're collecting data right alongside of them. If you're doing 8 hours of interviews, I'm doing 8 hours of the interviews. Like, we're doing it together. So if anything comes up in the course of the day, I'm right there, or Shannon is right there with you. You're always going to have one of the folks that you're like, I don't know if I can make this decision. You don't have to. We got you. We also worry about trauma and stress on them during field work. And so I want to be there to make sure that people are okay, especially my undergraduate team, because they make me really nervous. They're lovely and so strong. I don't know why I get nervous about them. They just seem young. So I want to protect them. It's bad of me. They don't need my protection, I don't think, but that's me. And then if for any reason we needed a backup, Angie Hattery, who's my colleague at the University of Delaware, is also very accustomed to dealing with these sort of renegotiations. Everyone on the team has read the full IRB protocol. Everyone has gone through hours and hours and hours of training about what to do in X situation or Y situation. Because we've been in prisons for so long, it's easy to point out all the things that have already happened, right? And how you would handle those. During field work, a lot of times Shannon or I often will step back from interviewing and take this, I call it mother hen, but I think she calls it like overseer, right? This sort of role where we're just moving, right? It's just moving around a unit. So in the places where I go, there are usually 4 pods or units inside of one unit, 4 restricted housing units inside one big unit. The team may be divided up, right? 4 of them may be doing interviews, 2 of them are doing recruitment, 1 of them is in the lieutenant's office chatting or whatever. But instead of me sitting down and doing one interview after another, I will be moving around. So I'll spend an hour with a psychiatrist going cell to cell and thinking and listening in on their sessions, or I'll go team member to team member and make sure everybody's okay. I keep an eye on them to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and that they're feeling okay with what's happening. So I'm constantly moving, and if I'm not moving, I'm standing in the hallway and I'm doing ethnographic field work, but I'm just standing there, right? I'm looking through the windows of the pods. I'm talking to anyone who happens to walk by me. I spend a few minutes or an hour or so up in the bubble, which is the control room. I'm all over the place so I can see. So my team always has access to me. They don't have to come find me. They can find me all the time. And if I'm not there, Shannon is that person. So it becomes easier for team level decisions to rise up. It isn't to say that my undergrads or graduate students aren't capable or fully able to make those kinds of decisions, but I feel like I already ask so much of them. I don't want them to be put in a position where they also feel like what you stated, that they might be compromising the project if they make the wrong choice. I would rather have them just put the decision off on me. And then later in our debriefing, we will talk about why I made that decision. And that, would they have to? And if not, we sort of negotiate it out. Maybe I didn't do the right thing. Maybe they think I blew it, and I want to hear that, right? And then we talk about why we're not going to do that anymore, right? Danielle screwed up, let's fix that, right? But that becomes a great debriefing point for later, that we can learn from each other. Danielle did it for this reason, but we don't agree with her, and here's why.
Awesome. Do we have other questions from the audience? So I have another question that I can throw out there, and this is it's a comment rather than a question, but it's a comment where I'd be curious to get your reflection on it. So I can't help but be struck between, this is I would hold this up as like a gold standard for doing especially team-based prison research. But as we know, there are a lot of people doing prison research, and you go to a conference and you see presentations where people have done research projects, and it's like, oh, that's very different. Like the methods are sloppy. The access was surprisingly easy. And some of this varies from state to state. Sometimes it varies from position, like sometimes grad students have an easier time. Sometimes they have a harder time. And I'm just struck by like how heterogeneous prison research is, where, some people are doing like a really good job, really methodologically, like careful, thinking things through, being systematic, being like very rigorous. And then others, it's like, oh, wow, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you got permission to do that, either from the prison or from your university IRB. And it's just this thing that's been kind of sitting with me throughout the whole talk. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about that, or if I'm just being snobby.
I don't think you're snobby. It is challenging. And not everyone has to do team research. I just want to make sure that I'm clear about that, right? If you're a person who just wants to go do your own work or work with one other person, then I think do that. I wanted to just present to you there are options, right? Because most people don't work with as large a team as I do doing qualitative work. It's a little crazy. It's ethically challenging to watch some of the folks present, or even the publications. Right, I get sent stuff to review all the time, and I think, holy cow, like the ethical considerations in this piece alone are enough to send it out, right? You can't publish that, and I don't hold everyone to the same standards, right? Not everybody has to have 4,000 hours of field work and 900 interviews. Like that's not what I'm looking for. But I'm concerned about what it says about research, but I think that's true. I would say my reflection, I think, is that it's true for everyone, right? You read the quantitative paper that took incredible care with their secondary data and really tried to make sure that they had eliminated internal validity problems, or that they had whatever it is, right? Whatever it is. And then you look at another paper and you think, what in the hell? Like they just threw that, like that's your hypothesis and you're just going with it, right? They don't have any care for how they get to the answer. And I think that's the same problem that we have in qualitative work. And I think it does a particular disservice to carceral work, because our access is so incredibly guarded. It's very, very difficult to get access to systems, especially to RHUs, right? This was a gift from the heavens, as far as I'm concerned, right? It may never happen to me again. And so I want to teach people. It's one of the reasons I like doing these talks, and it's why I teach qualitative methods all the time. It's why I'm out there talking. It's why the entire appendix of my book is very similar to the talk I gave today. I want people to understand that rigor matters, and it doesn't matter because you want to get published. It matters because it's the right thing to do. It means that you're collecting the very best data from the folks that you desperately are trying to tell their stories or retell their stories or interpret their stories, and you're not doing more harm than has already been done to them. That's the last thing I want, is for someone to say that they were harmed in some way, not only by the method I used to collect the data, but by what I wrote about it later. That didn't represent what they meant. That wasn't what they meant to say, or that was one voice. And I should have listened to the 50 other people that I didn't talk to because I didn't go during the second shift or whatever it was. It's why that sample matters. It's why the data collection matters. I want to make sure that I tell the best story I can, so that anyone reading this, currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, working in a system, or caring about a system, doesn't look at this data and get the wrong idea about what I saw in there. What I'm telling you, I'm seeing is the voice of the people that told it to me. And I have to be sure that I captured those voices as true. I'm going to use the word true. I'm a sociologist, don't hate me. As true to form as it was meant to be. And I mean true loosely, in the more subjective sociology sense, right? I mean, I want it to represent what they wanted it to represent. Also with my expert interpretation, right? Because I've got to theoretically frame it. I've got to do all the scholarly work that someone would do with that data. I don't want anyone to read it later and say that I got it wrong, or that I didn't do it the service that it needed. It would make me feel physically sick. I don't think I could look at myself in the mirror anymore. So I try not to focus on the people who aren't doing it right, and I try to educate more people to do it better. And I think Karamet's team and Kevin's team are also doing, and there are two of the big field projects that are on the ground inside restricted housing units or prisons in general, are both really trying. And I think Gabby's and Natalie's idea is that it's different. It just looks different, but it's still very good, right? And we should all be learning those sort of things to feel which ones fit with each of us.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we're basically out of time. So I'm going to ask everybody to join us one more time in thanking Danielle for a wonderful, excellent, educative talk.
Yay, thank you for
Virtual
having
real
me. I
class.
love this. Thank you all for
Yeah.
coming. I know you're zoomed out. I can't believe you just spent an hour and a half hanging out with me today.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. I can remember how to do that. There we go.